Okay, I think you can see my slides. So as Tereza mentioned, my primary field of interest is in language, but I am interested also in language as it is used in value judgments in general, and in aesthetics very often. And today I will be talking again about adjectives. Though it's going to be a different set of issues than the talk that I gave in, I think it was in November in Tereza's seminar. So here, let me start with an example just to get situated about the kind of things that we'll be interested in. So in philosophy, as I'm sure many of you are aware, there is a distinction between facts and values, which corresponds at the level of language to the distinction between evaluative and descriptive language, evaluative and descriptive statements. So here is an example. This is about Nahon Jin's movie The Wailing from a couple of years ago. When you, I'll be giving all of the examples that I'm taking are taken from Corpus, that is to say from real life resources such as reviews, online reviews, books, and so on. So here are a few examples of the things that you might say about this movie. You might say, this is another superb film from Nahon Jin. Terrible, overly long, awfully executed film. The movie opens with the police sergeant, Jung Gu, investigating a double murder in his quiet rural village. So this set of examples nicely illustrates this distinction between evaluative and descriptive. When you say that the movie opens in a certain way, it is a pure description of the movie. There is no evaluation going on. You're not saying anything positive or negative about the movie. Whereas in the first two, the first evaluation, this is another superb film, is obviously a positive one. And you can see that because the speaker is using this adjective superb, which is positively balanced. Whereas terrible, overly long, awfully executed, it's of course a negative evaluation. And here it's also signaled by the language, by words like terrible, awful, and so on, which are negative. So this is actually a simplification that people like to work with in language. Now, you might rightly point out that this is not the most usual way in which people talk about art. When you look at movies, yeah, maybe between us, we might say, oh, this was a great movie, or it was a bad movie, but very often in the evaluation of movies, the language that people use is much more complex. So here is again another example. 2.5 hours long, but never slow. The wailing takes its time to burrow under your skin, but by the time it weaves its dark, potent spell, it leaves you with a lingering, unshakable sense of dread that Hollywood horror films can rarely master. So this is again a positive review, but as you can see, the way in which it is formulated, it takes really to a level of linguistic complexity that is much more complicated and not the kind of thing that one can easily address by using the existing semantic models. So in the rest of the talk, what you will see is that we will be often looking at simpler sentences involving only subject and predicate and predication in a simple way without looking at all the possible complexities that you can use in aesthetic value judgments. In evaluations, people often use metaphors and things like that. So none of that is going to be addressed in this talk. But this is something that, that is quite customary to do so that you can start tackling the linguistic features of evaluative language. So here is the main aim of this talk, and it has changed slightly with respect to the abstract that I announced, because I will still be talking about negative adjectives that are used positively, such as harrowing and dreadful. But I also want to discuss, and that's going to be the first part of the talk, another set of adjectives, which are very often used in aesthetic evaluations, Those adjectives, unlike the ones that we have seen initially, unlike evaluative adjectives such as superb or terrible or beautiful or ugly, which are either positive or negative, are what you might call neutral adjectives, that is, adjectives which are not lexically marked for valence. And examples of those are adjectives such as intense, strange, and we'll see many more. So those adjectives are not in themselves either positive or negative, but they're very often used in value judgments and, among others, in aesthetic value judgments. And the interesting thing about those is that depending on the context, describing something as intense can give rise to a positive evaluation, but it can also give rise to a negative evaluation, similarly for strange and so on. So both kinds of adjectives, as we're going to see, raise some puzzles as to how you get to convey evaluation using language that doesn't strictly match the evaluation that you convey. So with the things like this is a superb film, there is really no puzzle. You use something which is lexically marked as positive and you say something positive about the movie, whereas we are going to look at things where there seems to be a bit of a mismatch. So I want to mention also that this is part of a broader project. So again, as Tereza mentioned in her introduction, my primary interests are in natural language semantics and philosophy of language, but it connects with aesthetics. So there is a range of issues where the interdisciplinarity is really required. From on the one hand, in natural language semantics, what we do is that we study meaning. We get models of linguistic meaning, and in particular, the study of adjectives as a lexical class has been very important. What's taken from natural language semantics is the study of adjectival meaning, how it depends on the context, and how this idea of a balance that is positive versus negative can be cashed out in semantic terms. Philosophy of language looks at how, when you use a sentence in a context, a sentence that is endowed with some stable meaning, how this allows you to convey an evaluative judgment. And finally, in aesthetics, there is, of course, a lot of study about the nature of aesthetic judgments. And that is, for instance, where there has been a lot of work done on the question of how negative emotions can give rise to positive aesthetic evaluations that is going to be relevant to some of the things that I'm going to talk about today. So the plan for the talk is that I am first going to spend some time on a project that I'm currently involved in, and it's a joint project with a colleague, Elsie Kaiser, on what these adjectives such as intense, strange, and so on, what they are like. So the idea is to get a grip on a class of adjectives which hasn't been much discussed in the semantic literature, namely those neutral adjectives, and see how they are different from the evaluative adjectives. Then I'll briefly talk about the question of how those neutral adjectives can acquire their valence in the context, and very briefly present two kinds of approaches to that issue, and then move to negative adjectives such as harrowing, and discuss again two approaches, a semantic and a pragmatic approach, on how negative adjectives can give rise to positive evaluations. So let's again look at some examples. I mentioned that the adjectives that I'll be talking about are intense and harrowing. So here is again an example from a review of the movie Mad Max Fury Road, where the author says that it is one of the most harrowing, intense, thrilling action movies of all time. It is absolutely epic. Again, we know that this is a positive review, that this is taken to be positive, but again, there is something of a question there, because harrowing is a negative adjective, so it's not a very frequent adjective in English, but it has a meaning similar to deeply disturbing or haunting, so something that really is a negative experience. Intense is not either positive or negative, and thrilling often is used positively, but per se is not positive. Now, one thing I want to stress from the outset is that it's not that this is a set of adjectives that is somehow polysymous or ambiguous, and that it has this positive meaning only, say, if it's used with respect to action movies. There are other examples where, again, using intense and harrowing is seen as positive. So here is another example from the Corpora. Amu, Haneke's movie, is harrowing, emotional, thrilling, intense, beautiful, tragic, and powerful cinema. And for those of you who have seen the movie, you know that it's a very different genre than Mad Max Fury Road, right? But still, this idea of harrowing and intense is present. Everest. So here we have another interesting example. I'm going to read it. The good news is that the film is intense enough to numb the entire body. The bad news is that it's not emotionally deep enough to freeze the heart. It earns its 4th star because it's so harrowing and intense. So overall, this is not such a positive review. It's more of a lukewarm review. But what we see there is that, again, both intense and harrowing get this positive valence. So what are neutral adjectives? As I mentioned, when you look at the literature, and that I think holds both for the literature in philosophy of language and semantics as the literature on aesthetic language that comes from aesthetics itself, it has tended to focus on evaluative adjectives, on beautiful and ugly, and elegant and garish. So we have positive, negative, positive, negative. In the literature on personal taste, things like inspiring and boring. So in this current project that we have with Elsie Kaiser on exploring balance and judgments of personal taste, what we try to do is pin down the features of adjectives that are neither clearly positive nor negative. So what I want to do here is just give you an idea of what the project is without really going into all its depth. So the aim here is to really distinguish a class of adjectives that have an interesting behavior. And so what we do in that with this objective of delineating neutral adjectives from evaluative adjectives involves several steps. So on the one hand, we are going to propose 2 linguistic tests that are such that adjectives which pass the tests are neutral, whereas those that fail it are evaluative. The tests are supplemented by looking at real-life corpus examples. So as you'll see in a second, there is often an issue with those linguistic tests about what is felicitous, what sounds good, and what doesn't. And so what we need to do is back them up with the existence of a large class of cases of examples. And then we will look at psychological norms of balance, and I will explain in a minute what those are. So the 2 tests that we are proposing, here is the first one. We call it the attitude compatibility test, and it is formulated as follows. Neutral adjectives can be felicitously asserted both in conjunction with a positive attitude and with a negative attitude toward the object at stake. Evaluative adjectives cannot, and this can be illustrated by these contrasts. So if you say, this painting is beautiful and I don't like it, this sounds slightly weird. It's not that it sounds infelicitous, but there is a markedness of saying it is beautiful and I don't like it. This painting is ugly and I like it, is again somewhat weird. Whereas this painting is strange and I like it, as well as this painting is strange and I don't like it. And similarly, this movie is intense and I like it, this movie is intense and I don't like it, are much more felicitous. And I will get back to questions about how we can judge whether something is felicitous or not, because obviously there are going to be contexts in which you can judge something that at the same time judge that something is beautiful, but also dislike it, so there is no logical compatibility. But I will clarify that in a second, because first I want to give you the second test that we are using. We call it the good, bad, way test. So it goes, so here there is a typo, it should say neutral adjectives can be felicitously, again, another typo, so only once felicitously modified with phrases such as in a good way and in a bad way, whereas evaluative adjectives cannot. This PPT is an abbreviation that we sometimes use for predicate of personal taste, which are only a subclass of evaluative adjectives. That's why you have it here, because we often talk about predicates of taste, but this holds, the test holds generally for neutral and evaluative predicates. So again, how this can be illustrated is by looking at the contrast. This painting is beautiful in a good way, sounds weird. Why does it sound weird? Because beautiful in itself is good. So being beautiful in a good way is redundant. This painting is beautiful in a bad way. It's in their context where this can be, of course, uttered, but just out of itself, again, it sounds weird. This movie is boring in a good way is again weird. This movie is boring in a bad way, similarly so. So again, to say that something is boring in a good way is almost contradictory, whereas to say that this is boring in a bad way is redundant. On the other hand, things like this painting is strange in a good way or in a bad way are perfectly natural. Similarly with adjectives such as intense. This movie is intense in a good way, it is intense in a bad way. So I want to clarify how this test methodology works. Going back to the attitude compatibility test, so we've decided to use these phrases of liking and disliking because they're the most natural expressions of one's positive attitude toward an object or one's negative attitude, and you find them often in language. But of course, one positive feature of an object is not enough to warrant that you like it. Nor is one negative feature enough to warrant that you dislike it. And what is more, you may even like something that you're aware has nothing positive. This might be slightly irrational, but that's something that can happen. And you can similarly dislike something about which you cannot say anything negative. So logically, it's of course perfectly possible to ascribe a positive property to something and at the same time deny that you like it. However, the test still works, we think, because when you express such conjunctions, what you preferably do is use contrastive particles, namely things like but, yet, however, oh, and you know what, things of that sort. So you might, of course, say, this painting is beautiful, but I don't like it. Now this becomes perfectly felicitous. And why is it felicitous? Because this contrast between beautiful being positive and denying that you have a positive attitude is something that you recognize and you mark it. Okay. Again, another clarification, this time about the other test that we use, the good, bad, way test. This holds for many tests in general. So what you might worry is that getting intuitions is something that is very context dependent. And if you are in the right sort of context, then perhaps any adjective can in the end be modified with the phrase like in a good way or in a bad way. And similarly. So here is an example where you do actually find expressions like boring in a good way. It's not that they are impossible to find. And I'm giving you an example. So here, boring is not used as an aesthetic adjective. It's rather used as an adjective ascribed to a person, a personality adjective. Ted was an accountant and he acted like I expected an accountant to act, which doesn't mean that he was boring, but well, let's just say that he was more adult than any of my other friends, more mature, more, well, yes, boring, but boring in a good way. So you have this phrase boring in a good way, and now you may think, well, if you do find like other adjectives that pass the test, does this mean that boring after all only looked negative but is neutral? And our reply is that the mere existence of some contextually felicitous cases where you get this modification is not enough evidence to say that this adjective passes the test, because with enough ingenious thinking and creativity, you can often come up with examples. But as you see in this example that I'm citing, the author, the speaker, needs to make quite a bit of effort so that the expression boring in a good way gets to sound good, gets to make sense, right? And when you have a neutral adjective, this modification by in a good way or in a bad way is something that is very straightforward and sounds very natural. There is just no awkwardness. And that difference between something sounding very natural and slightly awkward is really what marks the distinction. So in the paper, we look at a much larger class of adjectives that we distinguish in 3 subtypes. I'm going to read them because I think they're interesting, because they are also quite often used in aesthetic evaluations. And in aesthetic evaluations too, they have this very interesting features that in some contexts, the value judgment will be a positive one, whereas in others, it's a negative one. So what we call a context-sensitive class, which doesn't mean that the others are not context-sensitive, but this is because the adjectives in this class are such that their value, their valence, very much depends on what you ascribe them to. So here we have basic, complex, complicated, easy, difficult, formidable, intricate, obvious, simple, sophisticated, straightforward, uncomplicated. The excess class is the class where we have adjectives which somehow mark a deviation from a certain standard. So here we have excessive, extraordinary, extravagant, flashy, grandiose, intense, lavish, ostentatious, provocative, remarkable. And what we call a surprise class, amazing, astonishing, bizarre, interesting, intriguing, odd, peculiar, strange, surprising, unexpected, unusual, weird. So lots of those adjectives really are one of the bigger chunk of aesthetic discourse. So going back now to the tests, I'm just going to give you 2 examples with the adjectives intense and strange, where we see that they pass those tests, which makes them neutral adjectives. And again, the examples are from Corpus search. The Maddening is pretty intense and I like it. The Maddening is an album, a music album. His stare was intense and I didn't like it. He was very bright, intense in a good way. Being away from Diana at one part of the book hurt him so bad and made him super moody and blood rushing. It was intense in a bad way. Okay, and here are some examples with strange. Religious Overdose from Northampton were the first band to send me a tape. It was strange and I liked it. The way this book is written is very strange and I don't like it. Everything about this week's episode of WWE SmackDown was strange. The good parts were strange in a good way, and the bad parts were strange in a bad way. So in this approach to neutral adjectives, tests play one part of the approach, but then what we also do is look at what is known as psychological norms of valence, arousal, and dominance. Sometimes those models are called VAD, V-A-D. And this is the paper where, at which this is the work, it is the work of Amy Beth Warner that we are relying on. So basically these norms, what they constitute are large data where psychologists have asked speakers to rate a number of words, not only adjectives, but all sorts of words on 3 dimensions: valence, arousal, and dominance. And the one that we are obviously most interested in is the dimension of valence. What we use these norms for is to confirm, as it were, that these neutral adjectives are neither clearly positive nor negative. So what I'll very briefly do is just show you the ratings that people give for the adjectives that I've listed earlier. So there is the context-sensitive class, and here they are listed in terms of growing valence. What is interesting is that all of the adjectives that we are looking at have their valence that goes toward the middle of the scale. So the scale is from 1 to 9, and they tend to oscillate around 5, 6. But there are also some differences in valence, and you can particularly see those when you look at antonyms, such as difficult versus easy. So you see that difficult is judged more negative as compared to easy. Similarly, complex is judged more negative as compared to simple. So pairwise, we see differences in valence, but still overall, those adjectives are ranked for valence somewhere in the middle, so to speak. The excess clause, again, we see some subtle markings where, say, excessive is seen as more negative than remarkable or extraordinary. But again, overall, those adjectives do not have their valence either very low or very high. And so when you compare with adjectives which are clearly positive, such as boring, boring has its valence only at around 2, whereas beautiful has it for more than 8. So these adjectives are much more in the middle. And similarly with the surprise clause, again, we have this valence that stays around the middle. Okay, so briefly, what to take home message from these psychological norms is that neutral adjectives tend to oscillate for valence around the middle of the scale. Even though they do display some valence effects, so some differences when you look at their comparatively. And this is something that, so the second remark, very briefly, what we also do is compare what we call neutral adjectives with other adjectives which are neither positive nor negative, such as average and mediocre. And we argue that there is a difference between those because average and mediocre, it's not that they are neutral and acquire valence in a context. They basically do serve to evaluate something as being neither positive nor negative. So it's an interesting distinction, but I am not going to develop it in this talk. What I want to do in the remainder of the time is look at the question, so at 2 questions. First, how such neutral adjectives acquire its valence in the context. And we've seen with the examples that I've given you of movie evaluations that intense is very often used as positive, but there are also examples where intense is judged to be negative, as well in ordinary speech as in aesthetic discourse. So this now goes back to some of my earlier work, especially my paper, Expressing Aesthetic Judgments in Context, from Inquiry from 2016, where I look at this question much deeper. And so here I just want to give you an idea of what the approach looks like. So it's a semantic approach that in the same paper are compared with some other approaches that you might call pragmatic approaches. And those can be seen. So I mentioned two papers, Ellen McCready's Emotive Equilibria and Pekka Verinen's book. So Pekka Verinen's book is more about moral adjectives, but a similar approach would apply to aesthetic adjectives. And Ellen McCready's is more about expressive terms such as damn or fucking. So here is very, very roughly the idea of a semantic approach. So what many of those neutral adjectives, what they have is that they are what we call multidimensional, in the sense that there can be several aspects in which an object may be intense or strange or simple or complex. So looking again at intense, a movie can be intense in emotion, in action, in color, in sound. So each of those dimensions, so intensity can go over those dimensions, and there can be and will be differences as to the value of intensity depending on what dimension we are looking at. So for instance, for an action movie, it is a good thing that it should be, say, intense in action, but maybe not such a good thing that it is intense in emotion, whereas a movie such as Haneke's Amour, on the other hand, intensity in emotion is what becomes a good aspect, whereas intensity, say, in music or color is not what is good for such a movie. So the idea here is that when we are looking at values, it is not that the property of intensity is, as it were, a monadic property, which is either good or bad. The situation is much more complex. First, it's not really a unidimensional property, because to determine whether something is intense, what you need to do is look at the various dimensions in which an object can be intense, and the context is going to select the relevant dimensions of intensity. And then secondly, the value of intensity over a dimension is again something that is circumstance dependent. So it's not the property itself that gives you the value, as it were, but it is whether in the relevant circumstances, this sort of property is a good one. So the context comes into play twice. It determines how valence, so valence is the idea of having positive or negative value, distributes over the possible dimensions. And secondly, it determines which dimensions are relevant in trying to establish the overall value of something having that property in a given context, which in turn gives you the value of a statement such as this movie is intense. So this may sound complicated, but actually it's a kind of one slide summary of the approach that I have been defending, and it can be contrasted with what you would call a pragmatic approach. So the pragmatic approach, what it's going to say is that adjectives such as intense and strange, they give rise to statements that are not evaluative. So there are descriptive statements, or if you think that descriptive is just like what's factive, you can have some subjectivity in judging what's intense or strange, but basically the statement itself is just not going to give you any values. Nevertheless, when you use a sentence involving such an adjective, there is going to be background knowledge shared between the speaker and her interlocutors to the effect that, say, a certain type of object, such as a movie, if they are intense, then they are likely to be good. So it's something that is shared knowledge, something that the speaker presupposes, that the hearer also presupposes, and so on. So then by asserting something non-evaluative, you can pragmatically convey an evaluative judgment. This kind of pragmatic mechanism of implicating something given background knowledge, you can use not only with adjectives such as intense and strange, but with other like purely descriptive adjectives. You can say if you are a speaker in a context with a hearer, both of whom highly appreciate Korean movies, the speaker might say this is a Korean movie, and thereby to the hearer in that context communicate that it's likely to be a good movie. And this is very context dependent. So this kind of pragmatic approach, really what it explodes is this idea about what the speaker thinks, that the hearer also believes, and so on. So the difference between the two approaches is that the semantic approach tries to get evaluation at the level of content, at the level of what is expressed, whereas the pragmatic approach does everything at the level of pragmatic implicatures, namely what is conveyed. Okay, so I'm now gonna move to what I said I would be mostly talking about. I hope that you don't, that you won't hold this against me, that I've slightly switched to this other topic that I'm really interested in. So I want to talk now about negative adjectives expressing positive evaluations. So the picture here is of a book of the collection of tales by Shirley Jackson, and what I wanted to look at is this terrifying by someone as an evaluation of the book, where it is clear that judging it as terrifying is something expressing a very positive judgment. Let me just quickly. Sorry, I'm just gonna close the door. Getting some noise, so just want to make sure that there is no noise getting here. So adjectives of this sort, like terrifying, there are lots of those. Here are some that are listed: devastating, disgusting, disturbing, harrowing, heartbreaking, sad, shocking, tragic, and so on. I'm sure that you can think of many other examples. And the interesting thing is that they are all very negative, but can give rise to positive aesthetic statements. So in the aesthetic literature, as I'm sure many of you will be already thinking, there is this discussion about what is sometimes called as the paradox of negative emotions, namely the question on why it is that we tend to positively value artworks, the subject of which would in real life be emotionally very negative, very unpleasant. So here are just a few references. So the last one by Filippo Contesi is actually a bibliography where he nicely gives an overview of some of the important contributions to this paradox of negative emotions. Now, I'm not really talking about the paradox because it's something, as it were, that is going to come and supplement the work that we do from the more linguistic side. There are some very nice interactions, but the way I see it is that it's really addressing the question of how comes the statements involving a certain type of negative expressions give rise to positive evaluations, requires both work from understanding how it is that negative emotions per se can be judged, can make us appreciate value artwork. So it is something that you can think about even if you are not looking at language at all, and then questions about how is it that using a negatively balanced expression gives rise to a positive evaluation. So before sketching the two approaches that you can have in language, one thing that should be clear is that not all negatively valenced terms are so equally prone to be interpreted positively. So so with harrowing that I've been using as an example, if you use harrowing in statics, it's quite likely that it's going to be interpreted positive because it's such a word that you're not using often. It's very literal, whereas an adjective such as disgusting is something that is really very strongly negative because it's an often used adjective with a very expressive component. So you can see that sometimes you just say, disgusting is just an expression of a negative attitude without even really making a statement. So the claim here is that things like disgusting, they can be used positively, but it's not really easy to use them with a positive valence. So what it does require is that you are really in a context where it is clear that getting something to be disgusting is what the genre of the artwork that you're looking at requires. And here is an example about Cronenberg's movie The Fly. There are a few things as viscerally unsettling as your own body's rebellion against you, and the film accumulates a wealth of sublimely disgusting moments. While there are a number of beautifully simple beats like Brundle removing his fingernails and spraying fluid from his digits, the fly's coup de grace, Brundle's final transformation is one of cinema's most viscerally disgusting moments. And you can say that here, like saying that it's one of the most viscerally disgusting moments is something that is taken to be a very positive evaluation of the movie. But what I want you to observe is that turning disgusting into a positively balanced evaluation is something that requires some effort, quite some effort. Now, this being said, there are again two ways in which we can look from the point of view of philosophy of language at the question of how you get from a negative statement, such as this is disgusting, to a positive evaluation. And this time I'm going to start with the pragmatic approach. It mirrors the pragmatic approach we've seen for neutral adjectives. So basically what the pragmatic approach is going to say is that by ascribing a negative property, for instance, by saying that Hanneke's amour is harrowing, the speaker states something that is de facto negative about the movie. It is negative because the property itself is negative, but at the same time, there is shared background to the effect that movies that have this negative property tend to be good movies. So it is, as it were, a second order evaluation that the movie having a negative property is good for that movie. And so the speaker, given that background knowledge, again, pragmatically communicates a positive value judgment. Now, this can be contrasted with the semantic approach, where the idea is going to be basically that even though the adjective itself is marked as negative, it is still in the semantics itself that this negativity can be overridden or overthrown. So to see how this works, I'm inviting you to consider a case of something much more practical. So consider this case of self-induced vomiting. It's a practice which is known to be very bad. So in general, it's very bad to do that. It's very bad to get yourself to throw up because there are lots of things that can go wrong. It's dangerous because if the content enters your respiratory tract. You can asphyxiate, you can die. It makes erosions to the esophagus. It destroys tooth enamel and so on. So you can say that self-induced vomiting is a bad thing. I mean, it's pretty clear that it's something bad, but there are circumstances in which it becomes a good thing. Namely, if you're in a circumstance where you've previously ingested something poisonous, inducing yourself to vomit is probably the best thing that you could do. So the idea here is that even though some property has this, as it were, almost statistical feature of being bad in most circumstances, there are circumstances that can turn it into something good. And maybe even the word like turn it into something good is bad. It's not that it's bad and becomes good. No, it's mainly that whether something is bad or good is something that's very circumstance dependent. So just as in the case of self-vomiting, self-induced vomiting, properties such as provoking emotions that are deeply negative, being harrowed, being disturbed, being shocked. So very often in ordinary life, those experiences are bad. So they're negative, but there are circumstances in which having this sort of emotion becomes good, and namely those are the circumstances of art exposure and being exposed to artwork and appreciating it, where the fact that they induce you to a negative emotion is not just that it is second order good that they do that, it actually becomes a good thing, as it were, at the level of content. So I'd like to wrap up. I realized that sketching those two approaches, the semantic and the pragmatic one, I've done that fast, but I really want you to get away with the picture of how those two approaches work. So a large part of the talk, and it's a large part of my ongoing project with Elsie Kaiser, is to understand what neutral adjectives are like, that is adjectives which are neither positive nor negative, and yet are very often used in expressing value judgments. So we briefly considered also how such neutral adjectives acquire their valence in a context. And secondly, how negative adjectives reverse their valence, if you wish. And what distinguishes overall a semantic from a pragmatic approach is that a semantic approach tries to get all these phenomena of evaluation at the level of content, really see how you get value into what is semantically expressed, whereas a pragmatic approach accounts for them at the level of implicatures. And here I haven't talked about what would be the arguments for one and for the other. So I think that for the time being, I want to say that there are both very respectable approaches that we can have to this phenomena. And I do hope that in the future, there is going to be even more interaction between the work that is done in aesthetics and the work done in philosophy of language and semantics to get a better grip on how these phenomena work in aesthetic evaluation. So thank you very much.